Here we are at the techniques video tutorial number 1, which is not a surprise because we announced it, but probably not a surprise even before we announced it that it's about swatching. So swatching is really the foundation to the knitting that we do. And if you're not convinced yet, and if you're a regular watcher of our podcast, you know that we talk about swatching all the time. But I'm just going to go right back to the very beginning because some of you are newer knitters. Other people have been knitting for a long time and have never swatched, and other people are swatching experts. So I'm just going to start at the very beginning. So in a pattern, it gives you a gauge. So most often you're swatching for gauge, but for us, that's not the only reason to swatch. We also swatch to see how the yarns play together if we're using different colors, or what the texture of the fabric is going to be if we're going to make a fabric that we like. And because we make our own yarn and there's not very many patterns designed with our yarn, we use swatching to test our yarn in patterns when we're doing substitution, and this is where it's really important as well. So the first thing I'm going to say about swatching is that you're always should prepare your swatch with the way that you're going to use your fabric. So you're going to wash your fabric and you're going to wear your fabric in whatever garment or item that you're making. So your swatch needs to be washed and blocked, and there's hardly any patterns that I'm aware of that actually say that. The other thing is that when they give you the gauge for your swatch that you're going to do, they'll say so many stitches by 4 inches or 10 centimeters. That doesn't mean that that's the size that you make your swatch. That is what you measure on your swatch. And the reason why you don't make your swatch 22 stitches and hope that you're getting 4 inches or 10 centimeters is because your knitting changes as you knit, and you have an edge on your swatch. You need to do a number of rows, and when you get into it, you start to relax. And when you're relaxed, that's going to be your true gauge. So you want to measure your gauge in the middle of your swatch. So today we're not going to measure any swatches. I'm just going to show you how we make them. So the first one I'm going to show you is this beautiful one made from amethyst brooch in our Selkirk worsted. And this is a swatch Jennifer did for one of her sweaters to see how the yarn would perform. Unfortunately, it's kind of dark, but I think you can see that we do, it's a stockinette swatch, and we do a garter stitch border around the swatch because that helps to keep it from curling. So this one is curling a little bit because it's been hanging on our shelf for a while. But you start off your swatch by doing a little bit of knitting back and forth, which gives you a garter stitch edge on the bottom. And then you knit your swatch, and this is almost double the size that you would, your 4 inches that you would measure. So you have lots of room to measure in different spots. And Jennifer's left 5 stitches or so on the side, each side, where she's also done garter a stitch there. So you're measuring your gauge in the middle here somewhere, where you've had time to fall into the rhythm of your knitting. So this is a good example of a swatch. The other thing that I'm going to show you, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see, but it's also a good test of what the fabric is going to look like. So this fabric is quite soft, and it has a little bit of, I guess, toothiness to it, is what you call it. It's 100% wool yarn, and but you can see that you can see through it. So if this is the fabric, I'm not sure if this was the needle size that Jennifer picked for her sweater or not, but you can see that the fabric is quite thin for the loftiness of the yarn, and you're going to be able to see slightly through it. So if this is not what you want in your garment, then you're going to change your swatch a little bit. So this is a good general example of a swatch. There's another one that I'm going to show you, which is of a variegated colorway. This one is more to test the color and just to see what the fabric looked like. And this one is in 2 ply Selkirk worsted as well, and it is a variegated yarn, so you can see the variegation in the swatch, and it's knit at a different needle size. We have a tag here on 4mm needles, and you can see that it's a lot denser than the previous swatch that I showed. So you can tell the difference that a smaller needle size will make in the swatch. I still have the garter stitch border around, and you would measure somewhere in the middle of the swatch for that. This is another swatch. It doesn't have garter border because it's a garter swatch, and it was for the swatch that I made for the water shawl, which is a garter stitch shawl. So I wanted to see how the garter stitch at the needle size that I chose performs in the swatch, and it's garter. It's been washed and blocked. It's not, it's a shawl, so I wasn't worried about the row gauge. I just wanted to make sure that the stitch gauge was somewhere in the vicinity that I wanted. So we have a couple different ones here. This is a different sample, but you see we're always knitting extra on the swatches. And here's a good example of a sweater that Jennifer was going to make out of our fingering yarn. And it's a good example of what happens. We do this sometimes as well. So we start with one needle size and then go to another. So this swatch was actually started from here on this way. It went, if you're looking at it, you're going to look like this. And it was knit on the needle suggested, which was a 3.75, and the gauge wasn't achieved on this. So then the needle was changed. We just made a little demarcation line there. And then you can see when we go down to a 3.25, it's not super obvious if you look at the individual stitches, but you certainly can see the size of the knitting has changed. So this will happen in your garment as well. If you don't have the right gauge, you can add actually inches to the girth of your garment if you're making a sweater, or depending on what you're doing. So it's a good example. And we like to do this comparison because sometimes we feel the fabric and just feel which fabric that we like the best. Sometimes you're swatching as well, just to see how the colors play together. So people watching this video in the podcast will find this familiar, because this is thistle with pine forest, which is what I'm doing my hinterland sweater out of. And I knew that the colors were going to be great together because we did a little swatch. This was not to measure gauge, and in fact is not even in the same yarn weight as what my sweater is, but it was to look at how the colors looked together. So that's another reason to do a swatch. The other thing, when you do a swatch, you also can keep them as a reference. So if you're knitting with the same kind of yarn in more than one project, then we put a tag on the swatch that we've done. So this was this is Signature Aran held with Kid Silk Haze, and I've just made a note here that it was knit on 5mm needles. What the gauge was 14.5 stitches for 4 inches, which I would have measured in the middle. And I've put Signature Aran blueberry preserves with Kid Silk Haze liqueur. So I know exactly what I'm getting. This was soaked, washed and pinned out to block. And then I measured the gauge on this. And I've done ones with 6mm, so I know what kind of fabric that is. It's quite different. It's less stiff. This is much more dense and stiff, and this is much looser. And it's also the Aran weight with Kid Silk Haze, so there's the difference of the needle. And this one is a gauge, or not a gauge swatch, a swatch for color as well, because we use the liqueur Kid Silk Haze with a variegated just to see how it looks. So that's all we're going to talk about today. So the next time we do the next tutorial, I'll actually show you how you count the stitches and how you use the information that you have to be able to adjust your pattern, or adjust, I'll rarely say adjust your knitting, because that's really hard to do, and to keep consistent. You should knit in a way that's comfortable, and then adjust your pattern measurements and so forth to suit your knitting. It's much easier and more relaxing that way to do that. So we'll talk about that on the next